Parrot starts singing hymn. Mid-service, the congregation's reaction is unbelievable. The sun was just beginning to filter through the tall, arched windows of St. Anne's Church, casting soft beams of light onto the worn pews that lined the aisle. The quiet town had always been peaceful, its cobbled streets winding through rows of modest houses and local shops. On Sundays, the church was the heart of the town. It was the place where the town's stories were passed down, where relationships were built, and where faith was shared in the simplest, most humble ways. The congregation, a mix of old and young, had grown accustomed to their small yet tightly knit community where everyone knew everyone else, and the weekly service was as much about fellowship as it was about worship. Today, however, something was different. The morning air felt stiller than usual, as if the town itself was holding its breath. It was a Sunday like many others, but in one quiet corner of the town, in the modest home of Eleanor Wilson, the preparations for this Sunday were anything but ordinary. Eleanor, a kind-hearted woman in her early 60s, had always been a fixture in St. Anne's. She had a quiet grace about her that made her beloved by the congregation, yet she was never one to seek attention. Her life was simple, one of routine, filled with small acts of kindness and a deep, abiding faith that had been nurtured over decades. Every Sunday, Eleanor would dress in her favorite pale blue dress, comb her short gray hair with care, and walk the short distance to church, her steps deliberate and steady. She was known for her soft-spoken demeanor, her gentle smile, and her unwavering commitment to the church. Eleanor had no children of her own, but she had come to think of the people in the congregation as a family, each one a part of her extended heart. Today, however, Eleanor's preparations were tinged with a sense of unease. She stood in her small, cluttered living room, glancing between the old leather-bound hymnal on her coffee table and the small, nervous figure perched on the back of her armchair. Winston, her African gray parrot, tilted his head, his large dark eyes fixed on her as though he could sense the tension in the room. Winston was a creature of habit, as much a part of Eleanor's life as the church itself. He had lived with her for 15 years, ever since she had adopted him from a breeder who could no longer care for the bird. Since that day, he had become her constant companion. He had been with her through the quiet days, the lonely nights, and the moments of joy. The parrot was more than just a pet to Eleanor. He had become a confidant of sorts, offering her a kind of companionship that no one else had. As she rehearsed hymns for the church service, Winston would often mimic her, singing along with a series of melodies that she had taught him. His voice was surprisingly clear, and over the years he had picked up a repertoire of hymns, psalms, and even a few phrases Eleanor used in her prayers. He had always been an intuitive bird, picking up not just words but the tone and rhythm of Eleanor's voice. He was, in his way, a reflection of the devotion and love that Eleanor poured into her daily routine. But today was different. Eleanor had never thought to bring Winston to church before. The idea had crossed her mind a few times, but it always seemed like a bridge too far. She was a quiet woman who valued the serenity of the church's sanctuary and the peace that came with her solitary attendance. Winston, while a constant presence at home, had never been more than a silent observer of her spiritual practices. She wasn't one to make a spectacle out of things, and bringing Winston to church felt like it would disrupt the calm order of the Sunday service. But today, for reasons she couldn't fully understand, Eleanor felt a tug of something. Perhaps it was the deep desire to share a part of her life with the church that had supported her for so many years. Maybe she just wanted to see if Winston would enjoy the sound of the hymns in the church, the same way he enjoyed them at home. There was also a sense of excitement building in her chest, mixed with uncertainty. She glanced at Winston again, who was now hopping from one foot to the other, a small twitch in his beak. With a sigh, Eleanor grabbed a small towel from the counter and wrapped it loosely around Winston's body to protect him from the chill of the morning air. She knew that bringing him meant drawing attention, but she couldn't shake the feeling that perhaps there was something more to this idea than simple curiosity. As she walked to the door, she felt a nervous flutter in her stomach.
Well, Winston,
She muttered softly.
let's see what happens.
She opened the door, and with a final glance toward the empty living room, she stepped outside, Parrot perched firmly on her arm. The town was quiet as she made her way toward St. Anne's. It was a short walk, only a few blocks, but it gave her time to think. She wondered how people would react. She had always been a quiet part of the congregation. Her presence was never too bold, never too ostentatious. She didn't want to make a scene, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the beginning of something new. Something special, perhaps. When she arrived at the church, she hesitated for a moment at the door. The sound of murmured conversations drifted out, mingling with the light rustle of hymnals and the soft shuffle of feet inside. Eleanor paused, glancing at Winston, who seemed equally apprehensive. He tilted his head and gave a small squawk, as if to reassure her. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor pushed the door open. The familiar scent of incense and old wood enveloped her as she stepped into the sanctuary. The congregation was already seated, their heads bent in quiet conversation or prayer. As Eleanor walked down the aisle, a few heads turned, eyes widening slightly at the sight of Winston perched on her arm. Eleanor felt a wave of self-consciousness wash over her, but she kept her chin up, determined to make it to her usual seat near the back. She found her place in the pew and sat down carefully, adjusting Winston so he could see the altar. The bird shifted, settling in comfortably, his eyes fixed on the priest as he prepared to begin the service. Eleanor glanced around, but the church had settled back into its quiet rhythm. The sounds of hushed whispers filled the air as the congregation greeted one another. For the moment, Eleanor's worries seemed to melt away. She was at peace here, with Winston beside her. She opened her hymnal, preparing for the familiar routines of the service. But as she settled in, she couldn't shake the sense that something unexpected was about to unfold. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, the day she had brought Winston to church would be the start of something extraordinary, a moment that would touch the lives of everyone in that congregation and perhaps change the course of the church itself. And so Eleanor sat in the quiet pew, her hands resting gently on her lap as she waited for the service to begin. The service began with the familiar echo of the church bell ringing softly through the town. The congregation slowly fell into their seats, the rustling of hymnals and the gentle murmur of voices settling into a peaceful silence. Eleanor, seated in the back pew with Winston perched contentedly on her arm, breathed deeply, taking in the comforting atmosphere of St. Anne's Church. She glanced around, feeling a sense of warmth from the familiar faces, but she couldn't shake the nervous flutter in her chest. She had never felt quite so exposed before. Winston was a beloved companion in her home, but here, in the church, he was something of an outsider. She tried to push the thought aside, focusing instead on the priest, Father Thomas, who had just stepped up to the altar. Father Thomas, a kind man in his late 50s, had been serving at St. Anne's for several years. He had an easygoing demeanor, one that made him approachable to the congregation. But he carried an air of authority that demanded respect. His voice was calm and reassuring, and as he began the opening prayer, Eleanor closed her eyes, allowing herself to be swept into the ritual of the service. She had always found peace in these moments, this familiar rhythm of prayer and song. But today was different. Winston shifted slightly on Eleanor's arm, his sharp eyes scanning the room, taking in the surroundings. Eleanor smiled softly, trying to calm herself. She had always known Winston to be a quiet bird, content to perch and watch from his familiar perch. But today it seemed like there was an unusual energy in the air. Maybe it was her own nervousness that was causing her to feel this way. The service moved on with the usual flow, opening prayers, a reading from the scriptures, a hymn. Eleanor joined in, her voice soft but steady as she sang the words she had known since childhood. As always, Winston mimicked her, his keen ears picking up the melody and rhythm. But something was different. As the congregation sang together, Eleanor could hear Winston's voice rising in perfect harmony with hers, almost as if he was singing along. It wasn't the first time Winston had imitated her singing, but today his tone seemed unusually clear, his notes surprisingly precise. She couldn't help but smile at him, her anxiety momentarily forgotten, as the birds seemed to blend in with the congregation, adding a new layer to the music. But then, during a brief lull in the service, as Father Thomas was preparing to give his sermon, something extraordinary happened. It began with a soft rustling sound, followed by a low chirp from Winston. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she glanced down at him, startled by the sudden noise. At first, she thought perhaps he was simply adjusting himself or stretching his wings. But as she looked closer, she noticed the glint of something in Winston's eyes, something she could only describe as a focused energy, like he was about to perform a task he had been waiting for. And then it happened. Without any warning, Winston began to sing. It wasn't just a simple chirp or a random squawk. It was a hymn, a perfect rendition of the beloved song, Amazing Grace, sung in a clear, lilting voice that resonated through the church like the most heavenly of choirs. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. She had never heard Winston sing this hymn in its entirety before, though she had sung it to him countless times at home. But now he was performing it flawlessly, his voice rising and falling in time with the melody, every note sharp and true. For a moment, the church was frozen in stunned silence. The soft murmur of the congregation, which had been building as Father Thomas prepared for his sermon, came to an abrupt halt. Everyone turned toward the back pew where Eleanor sat, wide-eyed and unable to do anything but watch Winston as he continued to sing. His voice was clear, ringing through the air in a way that seemed almost otherworldly, as though the bird were channeling something far greater than himself. The older members of the congregation were the first to react. Mrs. Campbell, a woman in her 80s who had been attending St. Anne's for as long as anyone could remember, gasped and put a hand to her chest. Her eyes filled with tears as she remembered the days of her youth when this very hymn had been sung in churches across the country, when it had been a staple of their Sunday worship. Amazing Grace had always been a song that brought her peace, and now, hearing it sung by Winston, she felt a rush of memories flood back. Memories of her own parents singing it, of weddings and baptisms, of a time when the world had felt simpler and more sacred. One by one, other members of the congregation began to react. Some turned to one another, exchanging astonished glances. Others simply sat in awe, unable to comprehend what they were hearing. It was as if the very walls of the church had been infused with the song, and Winston's voice carried a kind of magic that none of them could explain. Eleanor, still in a state of shock, instinctively placed a hand on Winston's feathers, her fingers trembling. She had never intended for this to happen, never imagined that Winston's singing would create such a stir. She had simply wanted to share a small part of her world with the church, to let them see the bird who had been her companion for so long. But now it felt as though something far greater was at play. Father Thomas, who had been standing at the pulpit with his head bowed, now looked up in surprise. He too had been taken aback by the parrot's song, but his expression quickly softened into a smile. There was something undeniably powerful about the moment, and though he had never expected to witness a bird singing a hymn in church, he couldn't help but feel that it was a sign. Something meant to stir the hearts of those present. It was as if Winston's song had unlocked something deep within the congregation, something that had been dormant for too long. As Winston continued to sing, his voice rising in volume and clarity, the congregation was overtaken by a profound sense of awe. The elderly members of the congregation were moved to tears, their faces soft with nostalgia and reverence. Younger members, who had never experienced the beauty of this hymn in its full spiritual context, exchanged glances filled with wonder. Even the skeptics, the few members of the church council who were known for their rational, more pragmatic views, felt the stirrings of something greater than themselves. Eleanor, still in a daze, watched Winston as he continued to sing, feeling a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. She had never known the bird to be quite so expressive, and certainly not so powerful in his delivery. It was as if Winston, in his own way, was offering a gift to the congregation, a gift that transcended the ordinary boundaries of what they had come to expect from their Sunday service. And then, as quickly as it had begun, Winston's song came to an end. His final note lingered in the air for a moment, and then, as if he had completed a task set before him, he fell silent. The church remained still for a few seconds, the echo of his voice fading into the quiet of the sanctuary. Father Thomas, still smiling, stepped forward.
Well,
He said, his voice warm and full of amusement.
I suppose we've all learned that God's grace can come from the most unexpected places.
He paused, allowing the congregation a moment to absorb the significance of the moment. Then, in his usual calm manner, He invited them to continue with the service. But the mood in the church had shifted. There was a sense of wonder in the air, a sense that something profound had just happened. Eleanor sat back in her seat, her heart still racing. She wasn't sure how to process what had just occurred, but one thing was clear. Winston had just opened a door, and the world inside was something she could never have imagined. The church had been abuzz with chatter and excitement since Winston's impromptu performance. What had started as an innocent attempt by Eleanor to share her beloved companion with her fellow congregants had turned into a spectacle, one that had captured the hearts and imaginations of everyone present. The hymn, Amazing Grace, still echoed in the minds of those who had witnessed it. The older members of the congregation were still wiping away tears, lost in the memory of their youth when the hymn had been sung at every church service. For the younger generation, it was a moment of wonder, something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Eleanor, however, was still trying to process the whirlwind that had enveloped her since Winston's remarkable performance. As the service continued, Eleanor sat quietly in the back pew, her fingers gently stroking Winston's feathers as he sat on her arm, contentedly preening. She could feel the weight of the eyes on her, the soft gazes of the congregation that had shifted from admiration to curiosity. Some had already whispered words of praise for the bird, and Eleanor, though proud of Winston, couldn't help but feel a bit self-conscious. She had never been one for the spotlight, and now it seemed as though Winston had thrust her into the center of attention. Father Thomas, having recovered from his initial surprise, went on with the rest of the service. His usual calm demeanor returned, but there was a twinkle in his eye that had not been there before. He had seen many things during his years as a priest, but nothing quite like this. The congregation responded well to the rest of the service, though a new energy seemed to have taken hold of them. It was as if Winston's unexpected song had broken something open. Some hidden joy, some longing for the past that had not been fully acknowledged until now. As the final hymn approached, Eleanor shifted in her seat, her mind still spinning. She hadn't expected any of this. When she had brought Winston to church that morning, it was only because she thought he might enjoy the quiet, the familiar faces, and the peaceful atmosphere. She never dreamed that he would suddenly decide to sing in front of the entire congregation. Now, with the service nearing its close, she felt both overwhelmed and deeply grateful. As Father Thomas gave the closing remarks, Eleanor began gathering her things, preparing to leave quietly. She didn't want to cause any further disruption. Winston had already done more than enough to leave an impression. She stood up, moving slowly toward the back of the church, when she noticed a young couple waiting by the door. The man, tall and broad-shouldered with a sharp suit, stood with his arm wrapped around a woman who looked slightly younger than him. Her eyes were wide with curiosity, and she was holding her purse tightly in her hands. The woman looked up at Eleanor with a hesitant smile.
"Excuse me, Mrs. Wilson.
The woman said softly.
We just wanted to say how beautiful the service was today, and how special it was to hear your parrot sing. It was, well, it was truly a gift."
Eleanor blinked, surprised by the attention. She hadn't been prepared for anyone to approach her after the service. She was still trying to come to terms with the fact that Winston's performance had created such a stir.
Oh,
Eleanor said, adjusting her glasses nervously.
thank you. Winston's a bit of an unexpected performer, I suppose. I didn't mean for him to.
No,
The man interjected gently.
you don't understand. It was extraordinary. We've been coming to this church for a few months, but we've never seen anything like that. I think it really touched everyone here today.
He paused for a moment, as if considering his words carefully.
It was like the church came alive again, that hymn. It brought back memories. It made me think about my own grandmother. She used to sing that song every Sunday when I was a kid.
Eleanor's heart warmed at his words. It was the same sentiment she had heard from others after Winston's performance. Memories being stirred, emotions being unlocked. She didn't fully understand it, but she could see that Winston had done something profound. It was clear that he had connected with the people in ways Eleanor never expected. It wasn't just a bird singing. It was as if he had opened a door to something deeper, something they had all forgotten.
I'm glad it was meaningful.
Eleanor said, her voice soft.
I never intended for Winston to become the center of attention, but I suppose he has a way of surprising me.
The couple smiled, clearly moved by the conversation. After a brief pause, the man spoke again.
We've been coming to this church for a while, like I said, but I don't think we've really felt connected until today. I don't know how to explain it, but that moment with the parrot, it felt like something divine.
He paused and then added,
My name's Charles, by the way, and this is my wife, Emily. We've been trying to find a way back to our faith, to something real. And today, well, that was real.
Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear something so personal, so heartfelt. She glanced down at Winston, who seemed oblivious to the conversation, still preening his feathers. He was just being Winston, after all. But in that moment, Eleanor realized that maybe this wasn't just a random occurrence. Maybe there was something more at play here,
I'm glad you felt that way.
Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady.
It means a lot to me. I've been coming here for many years, and I've always believed that faith isn't just about the rituals or the hymns, but about the community we share. I think that's what makes a church. People coming together, offering something of themselves.
Charles nodded thoughtfully.
You're right.
He said,
And today, it felt like the church truly came together. We've been attending a lot of different places, looking for something, and today, I think we found it.
Eleanor felt a warmth spread through her chest. She hadn't realized how much she longed for that sense of connection, that recognition of the community she had been part of for so long. It wasn't about Winston's performance or the attention it had garnered. It was about the bond that had been strengthened, the sense of belonging that had grown in the hearts of those present.
Thank you.
Emily said, her voice quiet but sincere.
Thank you for sharing your parrot with us today. We'll definitely be back.
As they exchanged a few more pleasantries, Eleanor felt a slight tug at her sleeve. She turned to see Father Thomas standing nearby, his arms folded across his chest. His expression was warm but knowing.
You handled that well.
He said, his voice low.
I'm not sure I would have known what to say.
Eleanor smiled faintly, feeling a bit embarrassed.
I didn't know what to say either, honestly. I'm still trying to understand what just happened.
Father Thomas chuckled softly.
None of us really understand what happened today, but I think that's the beauty of it. Sometimes the simplest things can remind us of what we've lost and what we've been missing. And sometimes it takes something unexpected, a bird of all things, to remind us of the grace that's been there all along.
Eleanor nodded slowly, feeling the truth of his words settle deep inside her. She glanced down at Winston once more. The bird, sensing her gaze, looked up at her with his beady eyes and gave a soft, almost contented chirp.
Maybe he's the one with all the answers.
Eleanor said with a laugh, her voice light. Father Thomas smiled.
Maybe he is. But then again, maybe it's not about having all the answers. It's about being open to the mysteries, the things that we can't always explain.
He paused and then added,
And sometimes those mysteries come in the form of a parrot.
Eleanor smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over her. She had no idea where this unexpected journey would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. As she walked out of the church with Winston still perched on her arm, Eleanor was unaware that this was only the beginning of a larger story. News of the miraculous bird would spread beyond the small town, reaching the ears of many who would soon come to see Winston as a symbol of faith, hope, and unexpected grace. But for now, Eleanor's heart was full, and she knew one thing for certain. Winston had brought something beautiful into the world, something that would change their church, their town, and maybe even their lives forever. The following week was one of unusual quiet in Eleanor's life, a contrast to the whirlwind of attention she had experienced just days before. Despite her initial hesitation, Eleanor found herself thrust into the center of a wave of curiosity, admiration, and some skepticism, all centered on Winston's performance. What had begun as a simple act of bringing her parrot to church had evolved into something far beyond her expectations, and it seemed that the effects of that Sunday morning were continuing to ripple through the town in ways no one could have predicted. Eleanor had always known the power of community, but now she was witnessing firsthand how a seemingly small event could bring people together in ways that were both profound and unpredictable. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were from people she knew, fellow parishioners, neighbors, and friends. They all expressed their excitement over what had happened, and more often than not, asked Eleanor if Winston would be making another appearance at church. She laughed nervously, assuring them that Winston was just a bird and that she didn't expect him to perform on command. But the requests kept coming, from both the regulars at church and from people she didn't even recognize. Some of them were from out of town, driven by word of mouth or social media posts about the miracle bird. There were even people who asked if they could bring their children to meet Winston, as though his mere presence could impart some kind of blessing. Eleanor tried to maintain her usual routine, but there was a subtle shift. She had become something of a local celebrity, and though she was uncomfortable with the attention, she could not deny the positive impact it was having on her and on others. People had started greeting her with smiles and warmth, and some even thanked her for bringing Winston to church. It was as if, without meaning to, Eleanor had reignited something in the hearts of those who had witnessed the miracle. It wasn't just about the bird, it was about the sense of wonder, of mystery, and of community that Winston's unexpected song had stirred in them. It was as though people had been waiting for something to happen, something to awaken them from their everyday lives, and Winston had been the one to provide that spark. But as the days went on, Eleanor began to notice a more troubling shift. There were murmurs in the church about the attention Winston was receiving, and some of the members of the congregation, those who had always been wary of change or anything that deviated from tradition, began to express concerns. Some felt that the focus on Winston was detracting from the real purpose of the service. Others worried that the bird's newfound popularity was turning the church into a spectacle, a place where people came not for worship but to see a show. Father Thomas, ever the steady hand, had assured Eleanor that he understood the situation. He too was bemused by the level of attention Winston was receiving, but did not want to suppress the joy that the bird had brought to the congregation. He emphasized that the church was not a place for judgment, but for celebration, and if Winston's song had helped to lift people's spirits, then it had fulfilled a higher purpose. But Eleanor couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was slipping away, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. She feared that people were more enamored with the spectacle of Winston than with the message of faith that he had unwittingly inspired. Meanwhile, the ripple effect of Winston's performance continued to spread. News outlets, from local papers to regional TV stations, began to pick up the story. A video of Winston's rendition of Amazing Grace, captured by a member of the congregation and shared on social media, had gone viral. It wasn't long before other churches, even those in neighboring towns, reached out to Eleanor, asking if Winston would visit them for a service. Some even offered to pay her to bring Winston along, promising him the spotlight. Eleanor, overwhelmed by the requests, turned most of them down. It wasn't about the money, and it wasn't about performing for an audience, but she could see that people were beginning to view Winston less as a symbol of faith and more as a novelty, a unique attraction to be paraded around. As the media frenzy continued to build, Eleanor began to feel the weight of the attention more acutely. She could no longer step out of her house without encountering someone who wanted to talk about Winston. At first, the attention had been flattering, but now it felt invasive, like she couldn't go anywhere without people looking at her and whispering behind her back. Even simple errands, grocery shopping or visiting the post office, became exercises in navigating the curious stares of townsfolk who had seen Winston on the news. Eleanor felt like she was losing control of the narrative, and the pressure was starting to take its toll on her. One afternoon, as Eleanor sat in her cozy living room, trying to sort through the flood of messages and requests, the phone rang. It was Charles and Emily, the young couple who had spoken to her after the service. Their voices were warm and familiar, and it was clear that they were eager to continue their conversation from the previous Sunday. Eleanor was grateful for their kind words, which had helped her feel grounded amidst the chaos.
We've been thinking about what happened last Sunday,
Charles said, his voice thoughtful.
and we really want to do something to help. We know you've been getting a lot of attention, and we understand how overwhelming it must be.
Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected anyone to truly understand the burden she was feeling.
I appreciate that.
She said softly.
I just don't know how to handle it all. I never wanted Winston to be a spectacle, and now it feels like that's all he's become. People are asking for him to perform, and I just don't know what to do.
Emily's voice came through the line, gentle and reassuring.
You don't have to do anything, Eleanor. Winston has already given people something beautiful. It's not about him singing for people. It's about what he represents. Maybe it's time to help others see that.
Charles agreed.
We'd like to help you shift the focus, if you're open to it. We've been talking about starting a small group in the church, one focused on faith and how we can help others. We don't want the attention to be about Winston. We want it to be about community and healing. We've seen how much that moment has meant to people, and we want to help it grow.
Eleanor was quiet for a moment, feeling the weight of their words. She had never been the type to seek attention, but the idea of turning this situation into something positive, something focused on true faith, was a relief. She realized that this was what she had been longing for all along, something that would bring people together without reducing their faith to a mere spectacle.
I'd like that.
Eleanor said, her voice steady now.
I think that's exactly what we need.
The next few days were filled with planning. Charles and Emily, along with other members of the congregation who had been touched by Winston's performance, worked together to create a new initiative. They called it Winston's Grace, a group dedicated to fostering a deeper connection with faith in each other. The idea was to create a space where people could come together, not to witness a spectacle, but to engage in meaningful discussions about faith, spirituality, and the role of community. It was a place where people could share their struggles and triumphs, find comfort, and reconnect with the deeper, quieter aspects of life that were often overshadowed by the rush of daily existence. When the group first met, there were only a handful of people in attendance. Some of the elderly members of the congregation who had been moved by Winston's song, a few younger families, and a couple of newcomers who had heard about the church from the news. But over the weeks that followed, the group grew, and with it, the spirit of unity and understanding that had been so desperately needed. Winston's presence was still felt, but no longer as a spectacle. Instead, he became a symbol of the simple, quiet grace that had brought people together in the first place. And for Eleanor, that was enough. She realized that, through all the chaos and noise, Winston had done something far more important than just sing a hymn. He had sparked a movement that reminded the congregation of what truly mattered. As the weeks went by, Eleanor felt the weight of her decision to step back from the limelight and allow the focus to shift to something deeper. The group, Winston's Grace, grew steadily, its members finding solace not in the bird's song, but in the connection it had inspired. Slowly but surely, the community began to realize that the true message wasn't about Winston's unexpected performance, but the sense of unity, compassion, and shared faith that had bloomed from it. One Sunday, Father Thomas invited Eleanor to speak during the service, something that made her heart race. She had always been content sitting in the back of the church, quietly observing, never desiring attention. But as she stood before the congregation that day, something had shifted. She no longer felt self-conscious or unsure. The message was clear. Winston had served as a catalyst, but it was the people and their willingness to open their hearts that had made all the difference. With Winston perched calmly on her shoulder, Eleanor shared her story. She spoke of how, in the face of overwhelming attention, she had initially struggled with the spectacle Winston had become. But through the support of the congregation and the new group, she realized that the true miracle was not the bird's song, but the way it had touched people's hearts, drawing them back to the deeper aspects of their faith. Her words were simple but filled with meaning.
Winston has been a part of my life for so long, and I've learned that sometimes God works in mysterious ways. He didn't just sing for us, He reminded us that we can find beauty and grace in the most unexpected places. It's not about the bird, it's about what we do with the message He brought.
The room fell silent as Eleanor spoke, and as she finished, Father Thomas stepped forward.
Thank you, Eleanor, for reminding us of what truly matters. Faith is not a spectacle, but a journey we walk together. Winston has brought us closer, but now it is up to us to carry that spirit forward.
The service ended with a renewed sense of unity, and as Eleanor made her way to the exit, she noticed people exchanging smiles and quiet words of encouragement. The excitement had faded, but the sense of community had deepened. Winston, the parrot who had started it all, was still beloved, but now he was part of something much bigger than a fleeting moment of wonder. Outside the church, as the congregation dispersed, a few people lingered, talking softly about the message that had been shared that morning. It was clear that the miracle wasn't the song Winston had sung, but the way it had brought people together, reminding them that faith at its core was about connection, compassion, and the willingness to listen. Eleanor glanced at Winston, who seemed content on her shoulder, and felt a sense of peace settle over her. The ripple of change had begun, and in its wake, she knew the true meaning of faith and community had been rediscovered.